the Balkans and the director of the Center for Advanced Study in Sofia, an independent institution with a strong international and multidisciplinary profile, which supports through its various fellowship programs, freedom of research, scholarly excellence, and intellectual creativity in the humanities and social sciences. The program itself, as most of you would know perhaps, will last for 3 years and features 2 conferences at the beginning, at the end of the program, and 3 spring schools, and has been financially supported by the Getty Foundation within its Connecting Art Histories program. This opening conference aims to map the state of art in our region, explore the regional intellectual potential for change, and discuss the research directions in which archaeologists in the region want to engage. As you know, it had to take place this time of the year last year, in the hope that within 1 year we'll be back to normality. The fact that again we are forced to meet online is all the more regrettable, since the overall structure of this project has been envisaged as an opportunity of bringing together and hopefully generating synergies between scholars who work as excavators, as practicing archaeologists, or teachers, or both across the region. Of course, the idea had been that that given the largely nation-centered state of the discipline across the region, it rarely involves international and cross-national collaboration. And so that it is quite uncommon that colleagues working across the same border do not engage in a proper academic collaboration. The 2 conferences and the 3 spring schools proposed by the program are designed as a way of deploying new academic networks, and this is our ultimate aspiration: cross-national and cross-generational networks covering the region, and that aiming to enrich the field for a younger generation of archaeologists. The themes of the 2 conferences and the 3 spring schools have been proposed by the 2 directors of the program, whom I would like to briefly present to you. Alec Niculescu, Gheorghe Alexandru Niculescu, as the longer name goes, is a senior researcher at the Vasile Pervan Institute of Archaeology. He teaches archaeological theory at the University of Bucharest and has published research on ancient ethnic phenomena, the impact of nationalism on archaeological research, the politics of cultural heritage in Romania, and its impact on the conservation and visibility of the artifacts. Currently, he is working on the global asymmetries of archaeological research and on the properties of typological thinking and its consequences on the perception of the artifacts. Dimitris Plantsos, the other program director, teaches classical archaeology and classical reception at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. He is the author of numerous and varied papers and books on Greek art and archaeology, archaeological theory, and classical reception. Among his books, I would mention his Greek Art and Archaeology, published in Greek and English, and the seminal co-edited volume, A Singular Antiquity, Archaeology and Hellenic Identity in the 20th century Greece, which had undergone several editions. His latest book, The Recent Future, is a study of archaeological biopolitics in contemporary Greeks. It was published in 2016. And his study of ancient Greek painting in 2018 both of which were also published in Greek and English. Dimitris Plantsus is also the co-director of the Argos Orestikon excavation project. So, and I'll give the floor first to Alec Niculescu for a few words, and then to Dimitris. Please, Alec.
Yeah. Our goal is to examine what keeps in place the uniformity noticeable in the thinking and research practices of the archaeologists from Southeastern Europe. We have planned 3 spring schools, each dedicated to the most important agents that generate the current state of archaeological research. This year, we'll discuss the impact of the political, next year in Bucharest about interdisciplinary practices, and in 2023, about the intellectual and visual practices that shape the understandings and displays of cultural heritage. The spring school will include visits. The spring schools will include visits to museums, colloquia, in which the junior participants will present their work, and workshops in which lecturers and other invited researchers will discuss topics particularly relevant for each scene. This year, we'll discuss the archaeological interpretation of ethnic phenomena. We want to abandon the imitation of models as a way forward. Instead of promoting one way of doing archaeology, we want to encourage diversity and pluralism, generated by examining the current institutional and intellectual conditions in which our research practices are grounded, and their history, and also by examining how we determine the usefulness of something new, an examination that has better chances if conducted by constantly comparing what we do with what is done in other traditions of archaeological research. The opening conference is of great importance for what we are planning. It will show how we understand the discipline and its particularities in our countries, what are the salient areas in which we can detect sources of dominant sterile routines, and on what we can build our hopes for diversification and meaningful research. I have ended my introductory words.
Okay, so it's my turn then. Hello, good morning, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I'm offering these opening remarks today, albeit 1 year too late, and from the proverbial safety of my apartment in Athens to our conference on looking at things in Southeastern Europe within the framework of a 3-year project called The Construction of Knowledge in Archaeology and Art History in Southeastern Europe. And it is also my great pleasure to do this with Alec and Diana, 2 excellent colleagues I have yet to meet in person, though 2 colleagues I already consider my friends after so many months of preparation and joint effort. The following days will give us all abundant opportunities to discuss the state of archaeological and art historical research in our region, reflect on the intricate concepts alluded to in the titles of our meetings, and the way they help construct our lives as archaeologists, as art historians, as academic teachers. For now, let me just dwell on 3 fundamental ideas behind our project. First, that knowledge is constructed, maybe not entirely in the present, maybe not exclusively by us, but knowledge is never given, not something that has survived and changed from the past and subject to our scientific scrutiny in order to be revealed to our students or audience at large. It is a construct we too help put together. Second, that Southeastern Europe is a thing. It does exist politically and culturally. And even though some of us, Southeastern Europeans, tend to look further west, both for paradigmatic guidance and ultimately approval. And third, that we need to move beyond the archaeology art history divide in order to make sense of the past, especially of a past that did not think much of this divide in the first place. That in looking at things in Southeastern Europe or anywhere else for that matter, we need to depart from the humanist tradition, decolonize, and in a sense, declassicalize them, investigate their political, nationalist, or other entanglements in the present, and in a sense, reinvent their historicity by rethinking their materiality. I, for one, look forward to discussing all these issues with each and every one of you. For now, let's let the first session begin. But before that, let me just remind people chairing the session, the moderators, that they need to be very strict with time, and everybody else that we need to observe and respect the time allocated to us. As a reminder, it's 25 minutes for our presentation and 20 minutes for the subsequent discussion. So thank you very much.
Okay, now, can I officially open the morning session? Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stasha Babic from Belgrade, calling from Belgrade. This sounds like Euro contest song. And thanks you very much, the organizers and the directors of the whole program, for thinking of this excellent initiative and for taking it to fruition in spite of all these crazy circumstances that we've been living under over a year now. So speaking about time, now it is an excellent opportunity for me to rehearse this strict timekeeping regulation on to program directors. So program directors, please come forward. The first speaker of the morning session will be one of the directors of the program, which is Georgi Alexandru Nicolescu, and he will be talking to us about trying to do what we are told, dominating thinking in archaeology. So Alec, please take the floor.
Yeah, I will. I have a small problem here, but yeah. 16 years ago, during the discussion about planning the collective scientific project, the moderator named potential participants among the historians and archaeologists were present, briefly indicating in what ways they were supposed to contribute. Several Western researchers were named with their institutional affiliations and competence areas. When my turn came, he said that I would represent Romania. And when he mentioned another Southeast European researcher, he said that this researcher too will represent his country in the project. The first thing that came to my mind was the unexpected conjunction with a discursive practice widespread during the times of the communist dictatorship in Romania. Those researchers were recognized by the political authorities as the best, were always seen by them as representing Romania. That is, Romania was representing Romania as good as it could get, not a variety existing in their fields. It is obvious that history and archaeology in countries like the United States, France, or Germany are much better than what we have in Romania. And because quality comes from diversity, that could explain why a single researcher cannot represent his discipline. Since the beginnings of archaeology as a scientific discipline until now, all the leading researchers in all specializations, the best research institutions, the best journals, the best infrastructure, the best museums, all theoretical and methodological innovations come from the West. Today, most colleagues who want to make archaeology in Romania better think that improvement can be achieved only by importing more theory and methodology from the West. No Romanian archaeologist or historian has had a central position in the two disciplines since the 19th century to the present. The best were just compatible, never challenging the supremacy of the hundreds of great Western scholars that good archaeologists and historians respect and have to read. Other disciplines and other countries from the region about which I have information seem to be in a similar situation. The research quality differences between my country and the West are radical, as can be observed by comparing citation scores. For instance, the chair of the history department of Harvard University has more than 3,000 Google Scholar quotations. The dean of the Faculty of History of the Bucharest University has 7. Our best scholars in the social sciences and the humanities do not have more than 3,000 citations. The best Western scholars in these disciplines have more than 500,000. 30 years ago, during a Fulbright scholarship at the University of Arizona, I was expecting a fruitful contact with the American way of doing archaeology. But I have discovered that there is no such thing and more intellectual diversity than in my whole country. Being a good archaeologist meant different things for different researchers. And no one felt entitled or was willing to represent how archaeology was thought and practiced in the United States. The attitude to scientific novelty was radically different from what was customary in Romania. During a discussion with his teaching assistant, Michael Schiffer, one of the most prominent archaeologists of the anthropology department, asked him, asked him about the value of a new way of archaeological thinking. After receiving a somewhat positive characterization, he wondered whether that way of thinking was present in the department. He received a negative answer, and his reaction was, why not? In Romania of those days, the typical reaction of a leading archaeologist to a way of thinking with which he's not accustomed would have been, how can we reduce its impact? During the last 30 years, our archaeology has developed a growing tolerance for other ways of thinking, but the idea that diversity is a good thing is still missing. Toleration is in part an outcome of uncertainty, because now more archaeologists know that what is marginal might become a new authority. Among the rejections of novelty after 1989, the most spectacular is an attempt to destroy the relevance of cultural anthropology, a discipline largely unknown to most archaeologists at that time, archaeologists from Romania, I mean, made by a former director of my institute in the early 1990s in a public meeting with the following statement: cultural anthropology was invented by the French communists in the 1950s, end of quote. The obvious source for the reduced diversity of scientific thinking in Romania is the education system, which relies on the authority of the professors and tends to represent pupils and students as ignorant subjects, very difficult to educate if they do not have the necessary inherited qualities, that is, especially intelligence and commitment. Their only chance to become decent human beings and eventually researchers is to be obedient, to do what they are told. This is something much older than the communist regime. In 1919, Vasile Pârvan, my institute bears his name, at the opening of the ancient history and art history courses of the newly created Cluj University, declared that, I quote, the great heresy of geniuses being created in universities loses ground. No doctorate can make a creator of spiritual values, can make a creator of spiritual values out of monkeys with imitating capacity. School education has a modest task of de-animalizing the many and of providing technical abilities for the geniuses. Our method is that of cultivating and selecting superior souls. Those who are mere pebbles will be rejected, and they will serve as pavement for the construction of the new road towards the upper spheres. End of quote. All modern education systems share this paradox because they rely to a variable extent on the existence of something that cannot be educated, that is, on the cultural capital associated with social positions. They impose limitations on what they can achieve. Western sociologists of education have pointed this out repeatedly since the 1950s and have proposed remedies, some being adopted by the politicians from Western and Northern Europe. Nothing like that in Romania. That is why archaeologists are over-determined to expect recognition from political authorities and foreign scholars, not from their peers. Could one expect innate capacities to produce something new? That did not happen. No new ways of archaeological thinking were created by Romanian archaeologists. The main source of uniformity in Romania is domination of scientific knowledge by politics. The 45 years of communist rule are certainly to blame, because the official ideology claims that there is only one way of good thinking, deemed not only as desirable, but also as scientific. Some researchers describe this as political interference, but if we look at the beginnings of archaeology in Romania, we see that politics created archaeological research. In the 1840s, a crucial matter of the definition of archaeology, of its goals and methods, was decided by the legislation of the state, not in a local environment of archaeologists with a chance to choose what archaeology should be. The definition was derived from what aristocratic collectors understood by archaeology, mainly hoarding and antiquarian systematization of antiquities, thus the national state becoming their intellectual inheritor. During the 1980s, when I started working at the Bucharest Institute of Archaeology, political involvement in archaeological research and the will to impose uniformity was for everyone to see. Compliance with what the communist leaders wanted as a scientific representation of the past was necessary for anyone who pursued prominence in the discipline. Imagining other ways of thinking about the past was possible and tolerated when it was marginal. It was possible to be a researcher at my institute without being a member of the Communist Party and without ever mentioning anything remotely related to its ideology. Critical opinions about the political situation were frequent, even in public meetings, but they were not published. The existence of a dominant political ideology explains in part why major things, starting with the goals of archaeological research and continuing with the nature of ethnic phenomena, were not discussed. While the idea that the scientific truth is monolithic and self-evident for everyone who is not stupid, uninformed, or hostile was so widespread, and also why archaeologists did not imagine that they could choose from a range of existing theories and methods. The paradigm used at the Bucharest Institute of Archaeology was not explicit. Its theoretical and methodological principles were not stated in writing. It had no other name than archaeology, a situation which implied that all archaeologists understood what they were doing in the same way, and that those who did not were not archaeologists. The teaching done at the university during a few courses and seminars in history departments was viewed as irrelevant. The discipline was accessible only in master-apprentice relations, especially during excavation campaigns. The most appreciated archaeological activity, with no stated obligations and rights from either side and no time reserved for teaching. The apprentices had to learn from what they saw and obey. During discussions about the discipline, sometimes prestigious archaeologists were invoked and edifying stories about them told. They contributed to the construction of archaeology as something mysterious beyond reach, something that made one an archaeologist in ways that could not be described or imitated. The paradigm could not be explored. Its limitations in dealing with certain facts did not become visible. It was possible only to illustrate it, to apply it in new ways recognized by the best as appropriate, progress being conceived as an accumulation of those illustrations. Even now, with the political dominance of the Communist Party gone, many of my colleagues think that the rules of the game will always be out beyond our reach, and that discussing them should be avoided. Heavily internalized understandings of the discipline led to the idea that peer review can offer nothing more than a multitude of self-interested judgments. A few admit discussing the rules might be important, but they are skeptical about including in what is locally construed as a scientific goal worth pursuing, following a hierarchical representation of knowledge contained in the Latin dictum ne supra crepidam sutor judicare. As many of you know, these words were attributed by Pliny the Elder to Apelles, the most famous painter of antiquity, who accepted the advice of a shoemaker on the representation of a sandal, but told him not to extend his judgment beyond that. What archaeologists deny to themselves, they recognize to state institutions and foreign scholars. We tend to be skeptical about evaluation by peers, but the evaluation system introduced by the Ministry of Culture, or that is introduced by the Ministry of Education, by which archaeologists are ranked on quantitative criteria without any direct examination of the scientific value of the research, are widely accepted. The latter system of education uses rankings of the scientific journals, publishing houses, and conference venues as proxies for quality. According to the current rate of scientific activity, I will get 10 points for this presentation because it's international. The same presentation delivered before a Romanian audience will earn only 3 points. Some archaeologists had objections, but few were so radical as to dispute the right of the authorities to take such actions. The limited impact of Western scientific practices, such as peer review, of principles such as a Mertonian norm that makes scientific validity independent of the socio-political status or the personal attributes of the researchers, shows that we are not confronted with Western epistemocracy, but with locally imagined Western scientific knowledge, which serves to the promotion of uniformity and to the reduction of the autonomy of the local tradition of research. One of the most prominent archaeologists from Romania used to tell us about a famous German professor and what he told him during a Humboldt scholarship. He told him not to go to Florence to visit the art museums because he was an archaeologist and not an art historian. In 1988, I was able to meet the German professor during a conference, and I told him that I want to use the anthropology of Claude Lévi-Strauss in archaeology, something that seemed worth doing at that time. He did not tell me that I was not an anthropologist. He asked me if I was aware of the connections between Lévi-Strauss and the Frankfurt School. I was not aware of the existence of the Frankfurt School at that time. And during a break, he spoke to me about them. The German professor tried to help me extend my knowledge by exploring something that was appealing, not to impose what he thought about archaeology or anthropology. The reliance on innate qualities, on being smart, on accurately detecting who is in a dominant position, on the skills employed for gaining the support of authorities, generated by our educational system and encouraged by our institutions, makes local cooperation meaningless. Local colleagues tend to be perceived as worthless competitors in fights for recognition that can be fruitfully compared with a warlike behavior among the Yanomami, a population from southern Venezuela and northern Brazil. Richard Brian Ferguson has convincingly argued that this behavior was determined by the desire to control access to Western goods. Among the damaging consequences of this are widespread arrogance and dismissive incomprehension. In scientific disputes among archaeologists, anything a colleague says tends to be interpreted as disfavorably as possible and to be used as proving the capital crime of ignorance, which significantly is a capital crime also for politicians. Captives, like most local scientists, is a trap that makes from knowing the duty associated with a statute not something to look for. That makes progress impossible because everybody already knows what deserves to be known. In contrast, our Western colleagues praise hermeneutic generosity, write about ignorance and humility as epistemic virtues, and encourage dialogue. It is hard to imagine that some researcher from Romania will ever write a book like that published in 2012 by Stuart Firestein, who is the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences at Columbia University. The book is titled Ignorance, How It Drives Science. A good test for the quality of a scientific environment is boredom. I noticed it in many archaeological meetings, saved only by the presentation of new finds. Otherwise, because arguments tend to be evaluated as being as good as the status of the speakers, there are no surprises. Confirmation of what we already know is the only outcome. The current scientific policies of the European Union do not make things better. They encourage only competition, reinforce the idea that only a few are good and the rest are worthless, thus undermining local cooperation. Getting money from grants tend to replace other ways of getting recognition for scientific merits, and there are various ways in which local political authorities are associated with Western scholars in committees that decide what research should be financially supported. Making a good argument is less important now than making good money, something that can be achieved by the already mentioned skills of ingratiating yourself with the authorities by pretending you can offer them what they seem to want. Such grantees can make 10 times more money than their less fortunate colleagues. Why should they bother listening to them? Anyway, within culture historical archaeology, interpretations are evaluated by assessing the competence of the persons proposing them, as Raymond Thompson argued in 1956. This is scarcely a sound scientific procedure. Louis Binford commented 12 years later. Some Facts indicate that change is possible, but they are opportunities, not determinants. Change depends on the proportion between bureaucrats and researchers. There is a major difference between the attitude of subaltern bureaucrats and researchers towards authority and knowledge. For bureaucrats, the quality of knowledge comes from legitimate authorities, sources of the rules they implement. In contrast, scientific knowledge shows respect to scientific authorities, but the arguments from authority are excluded. And despite the towering presence of some researchers, scientific inquiry is anarchic. Good knowledge can come from anyone. Subaltern bureaucratic activity consists mainly in applying rules that cannot be changed, but applying them to new cases and in keeping accurate lists in which every item is placed according to the criteria specified by the authorities. They resemble the lists which are the main contribution of many archaeological writings. Good subaltern bureaucrats do not invent new knowledge and have no surprises when examining new cases. Unfortunately, the archaeologists who want to be researchers to find something new have to teach themselves. They were not educated to become researchers, and their training was made mostly of exemplary narratives indicating how the results of their inquiries should look like, not how the inquiry should be conducted. The current state of the discipline is not encouraging. The old division of labor persists. Theory is produced almost exclusively in the West, Southeastern Europe providing mainly excavations, descriptions, and images of the finds. Some of the great old archaeological knowledge centers from the West tend to become parochial, while others are torn between disconnected interdisciplinarities and borrowed ontologies. During the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a fruitful development of ways to integrate analytical devices borrowed from the hard sciences, coupled with the exploration of the philosophy of scientific knowledge, in search of ways to improve reasoning and argumentation. Now the analytical devices are poorly integrated, and instead of exploring epistemology, the sociology of scientific knowledge, or science and technology studies, 2 minutes more, and I will be over. So archaeological theorists, instead of doing that, they are focusing on ontologies, on being told what is real by actor network theory, for instance, not on constructing sound epistemic attitudes in the discipline. The current situation can be illustrated by examining how the work of Pierre Bourdieu is used by archaeologists. Plenty of references to his notion of habitus, nothing inspired by his sociology or scientific knowledge. The fragmentation of the discipline and the authority shifts in the world of archaeological thinking, together with the political transformations that took place in Romania after 1989, favor the development of a sort of peripheral wisdom, a notion coined by James Fernandez, something that enables us to better situate what we do, coming from the need to compare political ideologies and scientific authorities, something that requires taking the distance from them, because we live now in a world in which trusting others to make the choices for us has best chances of being adopted as a safe option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alec. Now, let's all imagine the applause that we would be giving if we were in the same room, right? And thank you very much for bringing up many issues that we can all relate to very much in our experiences, professional and otherwise. So I'm now opening the floor for the questions. The questions or the comments, please, if you have any, you can put them in the chat, or you can simply take the floor by unmuting yourself.
Well,
Oh, Professor Polavestra, please.
Thank you. I'll start because there's one interesting point in what Professor Niculescu said. It's attitude towards social or cultural anthropology within the socialist Communist Party dominated Romania, and that it had ideological opposition to anthropology, to cultural anthropology, and as we in Yugoslavia, and then which was also dominated by communist parties, a little bit different kind, have a different experience, because at least cultural and social anthropology was gradually introduced through Marxist dogma and Marxist ideology, starting with Engels' Origin of Family and so on. And then gradually, in mid-60s and later, there were translations and books and social anthropology books introduced in our science, in our Yugoslav scientific community, but very gradually, starting with Leslie White, Marxist, also then Morgan being the founder of Engels and Marx and Engels' view on anthropology, and then, of course, the others, Malinowski, Levi-Strauss, and others, gradually introduced. I don't say that it did make a strong impact on Yugoslav archaeology, but it was there, and there was this sort of unofficial, rather loose connection between social anthropology and archaeology in former Yugoslavia, and then in Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, Northern Macedonia, etc. So that is an interesting point that Professor Niculescu said, and I just wanted to comment on that and to ask him if that was really, why was it, in his opinion, so dangerous for Communist Party to get acquainted with, for example, Leslie White or neo-evolutionary anthropology in Romania. Thank you.
Yes, that statement about cultural anthropology was not made by the communists, was made by the director of my institute after '89. And he was an anti-communist. Actually, we all are anti-communist after '89. So the communist system translated Claude Lévi-Strauss. Not all his work, but most of his work. And there was teaching about cultural anthropology in the history department in the 1970s. So there was some, I cannot find the right word for it. They were certainly not very eager to have new things around, but they thought they were able to select what could be used, and they used anthropology and sociology, but they were not introducing them as backing humanist disciplines.
Thank you. Well, I didn't understood. I thought it was the official party line that.
No, it was not. It was
okay, I misunderstood. So it is rather similar than in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, maybe it was not clear. My phrase was perhaps to blame.
Thank you. Are there at this point some more comments or questions? If not, can I abuse my position as a moderator? Professor Nicolescu, you've mentioned, so far as I remember, twice in your speech right now, issues concerning scientometry. You started your talk by mentioning the number of quotes, the number of mentions of a Western scholar and one from your country. And later on, you mentioned again some points about publishing and being measured in those ways, especially your particular experience, how this event will reflect in your CV. So this is really a very burning issue, I think. And of course, it has to do with the funding agencies and with lots of other, with our career tracks in our own countries, our promotions to different posts in our academic career. And also it has to do with the funding agencies that do score us. So I'm not really sure whether I understood correctly. What's your stance on that? What do you think that it is a good thing that we are measured in that way, or you have objections?
I think it's a bad thing, and I know there are several resistance groups, to call them, in Western Europe and the United States. They want slow science. They reject evaluation made in this way. They want to reduce the list of publications to 5 titles and other measures that would help in this situation. The reason I use Google Scholar citations course is that they offer something that can be immediately be perceived as different, as a gap between Western knowledge and what's happening in my country. Of course, this idea that there is a gap and not a continuum of development comes from my experience, but it takes very long to show what I think about it. So this was an economical way to resume everything and to argue that there is a gap. Of course, it might be rejected because Google Scholar is not a reliable way to access scientific knowledge.
Well, not only that Google Scholar is not the completely reliable, but also scientometry as a technique is quite shady, in my opinion. So I just wanted to.
Agree.
I don't know whether you came across the scandal that broke out about 6 months ago, I think, when it became apparent that the Nobel Prize winner was in fact swindling with her citation index. So it happens all over the place. And
Yes.
the whole publisher perish havoc that started 30 years ago is now bearing its fruits. And people are doing quite a lot of things to get published, even swindling in all kinds of ways. And I'm wondering whether we should take it for granted or try to go with the flow, or perhaps think about other ways of acknowledging what we are doing. You said that there is a knowledge gap between a Western scholar and the Romanian scholar, or any other Southeastern European country person, because the Southeastern European person is less cited. I don't really think it is necessarily a knowledge gap. It's a publication gap. And there are lots of other things influencing the fact. How frequently we are published, how frequently we are published in foreign languages, how frequently we are published in our local languages, which remains completely unknown to the outer world. So I'm sorry for bringing this up so fervently, but I'm really very worried about scientometric parameters in our lives, especially because I think I see them as a kind of a really blunt tool to measure what we are doing. And I'm quite uneasy about the fact that most of our lives, most of our academic lives, are in fact governed by these regulations and these measures, which are extremely non-precise. And so I'm sorry for bringing this up so elaborately, but I think it is important, especially for us gathered here today. We are speaking English right now. It's nobody's native language of 20-something people we are gathered here. We speak English in order to communicate.
Yeah.
We don't speak any of our local languages.
No.
And we try to communicate in the language that we try to publish in, and it is kind of an obligation of ours in order to be seen, in order to be acknowledged internationally. We have to be fluent in English, and English and American people can only be fluent in their native language when writing or speaking. So there is an imbalance in the start. I think that Dimitris has something to say. Am I right?
Yes, thank you. I would like to take your point about and what about apparently Alex said about the knowledge gap. I don't think there is such thing. The bias against regional archaeologies is the same is like the bias against regional histories. I am a privileged archaeologist simply because I study classical Greece. So I have no problem to find an audience, even if my scholarship is below par, even if my scholarship is not up to a high standard. And I'm joined here today by my colleagues, Professors Papadakos and Vavouranakis, who study prehistoric Greece, which is also classicalized because, of course, Minoan Crete is, come on, the first throne in Europe and all that. And because our department in Athens is split between historians and archaeologists, I can verify that the problem you describe, Alec, is the same our colleagues, Greek historians studying modern Greece, are facing, because modern Greece is regional. Classical Greece, including prehistory, is global. So I can see, although of course I've subscribed completely to what Professor Babic just said about audit culture and how metrics can or cannot establish the standard of scholarship in a person or in a department or whatever. I think there is another bias here. The idea of regional studies versus something that is globally relevant. And this is something that in this program we can and we should attack. This is the idea. One of the ideas behind this program is precisely this, that you need to declassicalize, decolonize archaeology in order to make it relevant as such, not as something that the Renaissance discovered in the 19th century loved so bloody much. So this as an interlude to what I'm going to say in a few minutes.
Well, I can certainly relate to that, because one of my academic hats is teaching Greece, Greek archaeology, and I've been doing some of my classical reception stuff in my life. So yes, very much it depends on the subject that we are dealing with, and depends on the hotness of the issue. For example, people from my part of the Balkans that are doing, for example, things about Lepenski Vir will always get published, regardless of the quality of their scholarship. So this is not that I'm implying there is poor scholarship. I'm simply saying that some topics are hotter than others and can get the audience much more quickly. Okay, so I was told by Diana to be very severe and strict about the time. So I'm going to do that. And I'm now giving the floor to the other program director, Professor Dimitris Planzos, with the subject that I'm personally very much interested in. So please, Dimitris, take the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my PowerPoint presentation. It should be up and running by now. So my topic this morning sounds art historical, archaeological rather than anything else, though I think it is no less political than anything else. The basis of the Western visual arts is the representation of reality, cited historian Eric Hobsbawm in an essay titled "Where Are the Arts Going?" First written in 1996. In this paper, Hobsbawm was trying to forecast a viable chart for the development of the arts of the 21st century. A century he did not live to see, obviously. To that end, he produced an extensive account of development during the last 100 years, including what he described as the emergence of the avant-garde, mostly as a form of rejection of representationalism. His narrative confirms the role of what the Greeks identified as mimesis, that is the representation of nature in art so as to produce an illusion of the real, in our understanding of art, past and present. So this is something Hobsbawm was pushing for. It also indicates the burden of what we accept and honor as classical heritage. In talking of mimesis, Hobsbawm was very likely thinking of Ernst Gombrich, art history's great modernist exponent, as well as its most celebrated modernizer. Gombrich's narrative for world art based on a plain, even commonsensical set of tools, including biography, aesthetic appeal, linearity, and teleology, that is a fundamentally Western art historical approach, still extremely influential, in Greece at least, but I think everywhere else, established mimesis as art's inherent value and accordingly every artist's most formidable quest. In that, Gombrich was following a long tradition going back to Vasari and even Pliny before him, a system of rigorous encyclopedic taxonomies devised through empiricist trial and error in order to make sense of art and its practitioners. Based on this system, the art of the past is conceived as an autonomous ontology, living and growing irrespective of its time, even though it may be taken to be an expression of it, an expression of that time. Archaeology is in many respects an inheritor of this, ostensibly a scientific discipline operating under the pretext of value-free thinking and a seemingly positivist methodology achieved through rigorous verification protocols. Archaeology studies artifacts as pieces of evidence, tangible as well as transparent, in order to elucidate a past that lies hidden, waiting to be discovered and explored. Classical archaeology, in particular, devoted to the study of Greece and Rome, endeavors to study and promote what the West has long recognized as treasured cultural pillars. Part of a highly coveted classical tradition, Greek and Roman artifacts are systematically deployed as paragons of a monumentalized European genealogy, supporting cultural and social hierarchies and confirming the cultural as well as political supremacy of the West, or a particular breed of a West that is stereotypically conceived as predominantly white, male, and Judeo-Christian. Based on breakthroughs realized in the late 19th century, for most of the 20th century, archaeology underwent a sort of catalog fever, cataloging of artifacts, that is, objects discovered, analyzed, interpreted, and treasured by a discipline that was becoming increasingly disciplined, turned into an inherent archaeological vice, confirming archaeologists' empiricist bias. When those artifacts were also recognized as objets d'art within a cultural historical universe, as was most certainly the case with Greek vases or Roman statues, and soon enough with any art that could be celebrated as classical, connoisseurship kicked in, devoted to its perennial interest of restitution and authentication through what classical archaeologists soon learned to recognize as individual, though often anonymous artists and their distinctively personal styles. Besides fundamentally cultural historical, this was thoroughly phallogocentric exercise in the sense described by Jacques Derrida, but someone had to do it, and we did. Behind everything theorized is as an artifact lay the interpretive genius of a man, its creator, and not much else. It was an ostensibly anthropocentric reading of the past based on the belief in exceptional creators and the quest for their often elusive creations. What it did promote, however, was a kind of naive pre-Kantian metaphysics that promised the discovery of objective truths through the deployment of formalized and standard methodologies. During the second half of the 20th century, archaeology experienced a series of turns that called for a thorough revision of its epistemology as well as its constituent ideologies. An anthropological turn materialized through both what became known as new or processual archaeology, as well as its post-processual successor. That meant that past cultures were now approached not as primeval ontologies waiting to be dealt with by modern episteme, but as textual constructs imbued with the agency of their own historicity, helping fashion contemporary ideas about the past, which of course meant enable historically charged narratives of the present condition. And a linguistic turn of sorts, forcing archaeologists to deal with the discrepancies between the traditional tools of iconography, iconology, and connoisseurship. Archaeologists were a bit late to embrace the linguistic turn as such, but when they finally did, by the last couple of decades of the 20th century, archaeology, and more to the point, archaeological artifacts, were seen under a different light. Post-structuralist linguistics and deconstruction in particular shook archaeologists' long-lasting confidence in the text, written, oral, cultural, or other, thus challenging its traditional belief in universal theories and systems of measurement, in the principles of objectivity and verification, as well as the conviction that archaeologists are external to the histories they study. This new approach enabled a turn to tactility, materiality, and other sensory, or in any way non-textual qualities of culture, and its material remains. More to the point, it sidestepped the traditional kind of quasi-scientific discourse based on the apparent neutrality of the text and the presumed impartiality of its reader. As a result of these developments, archaeology was now understood and exposed as an allochronic discourse, studying other peoples and other specialities and temporalities, and in effect, as an exercise in studying a people's past as a way of colonizing that people's social imaginary. In other words, constructing the other as an artifact and an archaeological one at that. Classical archaeology, on the other hand, and the study of classical art in particular, have more or less remained indifferent to this ideological as well as epistemological shift. In the remainder of this paper, I will endeavor to investigate how the engagement with such approaches may reverse the standard flow of disciplinary power in classical Greece from artist to viewer, as well as in classics at large from scholar to the general public. Before this, however, a few more words on that we could define as a sort of materialist turn in archaeology and on what that would entail. Archaeologists deal with objects. Nevertheless, this does not make them inherently better in understanding their materiality, that is the capacity of things to transform human experience by determining our behavior and identity through the properties inherent in them from their own make. Rooted in the Enlightenment and the humanist tradition at large, archaeology assumes a number of given polarities in its study of the physical world and takes them for granted in its epistemology: human versus artifact, real versus ideal, textual versus visual, and so on. All these pairs express a deeper dichotomy in the way mainstream Western thought comprehends and classifies the world. Subject versus object, present versus past, and our favorite, praxis versus theory. As a result, even though archaeology is supposed to study things, it does so through a socio-cultural understanding that describes them in an anthropocentric fashion that is only a somebody's, a human person's, creations, possessions, tools, weapons, and ultimately garbage. This is how things turn to artifacts, that is, objects imbued with meaning supposedly created by the humans that made them. Since the 1990s, however, certain developments in the social sciences have encouraged archaeologists to rethink the way they configure the material world. And now I'm starting on a bit that Alec probably will not approve of. Theorists like Bruno Latour initiated an attempt to understand ways in which materials influence the life and thinking of people irrespective of human agency. In his effort to reassemble the social, Latour argued that anything that does modify a state of affairs by making a difference is an actor. And that certainly includes non-human objects, which are nowhere to be said and everywhere to be felt. Rather than as mere bearers of social structures and meanings, non-human entities are considered as active agents within the social networks consisting of humans and non-humans. The concept of networks, long developed in social anthropology, but only recently arrived in archaeology, is particularly important, I believe, in relevant approaches. Network approaches challenge the traditional concept of interaction between separate entities and emphasize instead the fluxes and flows across a range of spatial scales. This enables a relational and dynamic perspective wherein the properties of things and materials in general can be seen to emerge rather than simply be. Materiality has hesitantly introduced to archaeology with hesitation in the last years of the 20th century, and this has often produced rather awkward results, especially when it was considered as an alien idea forced into a pre-existing system of thought. Eventually, however, as Lynn Maskell put it 15 years ago now, archaeologists are realizing they have to move beyond the representational economy, right at the time when Hobsbawm was pushing for more representation in art. What this entails is not quite understood yet. However, this new representational economy would have to involve less of archaeology's traditional materialism, also evident in new archaeology, as well as its inherent humanism, mostly indulged in by classical archaeology, of course, but also central in post-processualism. At any rate, this new cultural narrative would have to become less art historical and as such more historical, in fact, disregarding Hobsbawm's frustration over the fate of representationalism in favor of a more anthropological and less aestheticized reading of past cultures and their material remains. Directly or indirectly, any attempt to understand agency in cultural artifacts draws its inspiration from Alfred Gell's pioneering work in the mid-1990s. In his Art and Agency, published posthumously, Gell identified art as neither an aesthetic nor a quasi-linguistic phenomenon, thus excluding both connoisseurship and semiotics from the study of cultural artifacts. For some time, like with materiality, agency was yet another awkward term for archaeologists, an inevitable yet impossible strategic choice, since it undermined some of their discipline's most treasured methodologies, such as stylistic studies and their semiotics. As archaeology was becoming more anthropological, however, the concept of agency, both as a counterpart to materiality and on its own, has enabled archaeologists to refine their understanding of cultural relationships, thus moving away from an essentialist humanist agenda. Let us then present a list of what this endeavor is all about. The anthropological shift we outlined above, in tandem with a certain post-linguistic turn, that is the abandonment of the earlier conviction that culture, or indeed art, is language. And this may result in the following. A turn, at long last, of artifacts into things. That is, the shift from innate, stable, and dead objects available to ostensibly scientific scrutiny to enmeshed, engaged, and entangled things which create, in the words of Ian Hodder, continual flows of matter, energy, and information, thus turning isolated artifacts, museum pieces, and objets d'art to things in archaeological and social contexts. This marks a shift from an art historical discourse focusing on the producer and the technologies of production that he, and very rarely she, employs, to an emphasis on the user and the viewer. Thus, from emphasis on the meaning of the object ascribed during production, we move to multiple, even contradictory meanings created in hitherto antithetical ways: gendered, embodied, mnemonic, sensorial. Accordingly, our discipline may be seen to digress from an earlier anthropocentric agenda to a discussion of human and non-human alike, and this is the marked difference of post-humanist archaeology with regard to earlier attempts in iconology and art history triggered by the linguistic turn in the late 1960s. The turn, finally, from monuments as products to humans, to an understanding of material culture as the agent of social interaction through memory and sensual experience, allows us, archaeologists, to move from the mere recording of material properties to understanding the affordance of these properties and the ways they enable or restrain interaction between humans and non-humans. In a word, it enables archaeology to put history back in art history. So let me substantiate all this before I close with an example. Sometime in the early 7th century BCE, a man called Mantiklos brought an offering to a sanctuary of Apollo in Thebes in the shape of a 30-centimeter tall figurine made of bronze representing the god himself. The statuette is now in Boston. The statuette, now having lost about 1/3 of its original size, was an image of Apollo himself, wearing nothing but a wide belt around his waist, a tall helmet, now lost, and holding his bow and arrows, now also lost, along with the statue's right hand. Now, looking rather dim, with the dark green patina we have come to expect from classical bronzes, originally the statuette would have carried a highly polished, bright, gold-like hue. To the classically trained eye of a contemporary scholar, it certainly looks crude, schematic, unaccomplished, primitive. Its patent clumsiness can only tell us that any classical miracles will not be forthcoming for quite some time yet. Still, one cannot expect a viewer in the 7th century BCE to have complained that such artifacts seem too schematic or more frontal than they ought to be, or too pre-classical for their own taste. The statuette commanded its own space, as well as the space around, through its make, its iconography, and the intentionality of aesthetic. The latter is declared through an inscription the figure carries sprayed over the god's thighs, in what to our eyes seems a rather unsightly and thoroughly unartistic manner. In modern terms, we would be tempted to talk of vandalism. The inscription reads, Mantiklos offered me to the far shooter with a silver bow as a tithe, and you, O Phoebos, that is Apollo, may you give him some pleasing reward. The first striking feature the inscription is sharing is the fact that it is a statue, not the dedicant, who is poised to address the viewer. This is between the artifact and the viewer. Thus, the statue as a separate entity intercedes in the exchange between the dedicant and the viewer in order to inform the latter in the first person about the former's ties with the divinity the statue itself is representing. The text inscribed into the bodies of this and other such divine creatures deploy an intricate network of interrelations. The viewer is expected to appreciate the dedicant's devotion as well as social rank and means which permit her or him to erect such an effigy in the first place. Mantiklos's offering is described as a decati, as a 1/10 of his annual income. Hence, the viewer is invited to make the calculation in order to establish how much Mantiklos is actually worth. 50 years later or so, an inscription on a statue of Artemis from her sanctuary on Delos would state not only just the name of the dedicant and a woman named Nicandre, but also that of her father, her brother, and her newly wed husband. As with Mantiklos, with Nicandre too, it is the statue that seems to be addressing the viewer, creating a social identity for its dedicant. The statue thus functions as a discriminatory tool, as it makes apparent who in that society is entitled to erect such dedications to Apollo or Artemis and who is not. Ostensibly acting as mediators between the dedicants and the divinities they portray, these statues in fact mediate the dedicants' social importance to the viewers, as it is them whom they're addressing. In this respect, such artifacts become works of writing as much as sculpture. This, however, does not mean they can be read as straightforward text, the way traditional linguistically informed wisdom would have it. The epigrams inscribed on the statues demand of the viewer to perform the act of reading in full, which in those days would mean reading the verses out loud. Since silent reading does not appear to have been widely practiced in Greece before the mid-5th century, reading such texts in the open air would require a performance of sorts, whereby the viewer becomes an actor impersonating the statue he is looking at. In the words of American sociologist Richard Sennett, the Greek reader would have thought he heard the voices of real people speaking. Vocal reading, therefore, acquires a performative trope which employs the viewer in order to enable the statue's own agency. In this sense, the texts inscribed on these and similar dedications act through their own materiality rather than their inherent textual qualities. For the statuette of Mantiklos discussed here, an essential part of its interaction with its viewer would be, besides the acts of looking and reading, also the act of handling the statue. Gell argued that far from being a matter of meaning and communication, art is instead about doing. This doing is what we theorize as agency, in the belief that artifacts, including objets d'art, function as material entities which interact with the viewers and users by motivating the response. Gell's theory seemed to work better with non-representational, non-visual art. Its impact onto archaeology, however, was such that many classical archaeologists felt tempted to experiment with it in the study of classical art. Soon enough, scholars realized that the nature of agency affected the way we understand the materiality of things, and that a correlation between the two concepts was necessary in order to proceed with a new theory of material culture. Understanding the materiality of the material world as processual and in flux enables new interpretations of the ways ancient Greeks interacted with the things surrounding them. In other words, what we understand as materiality comes pretty close to what the Greeks of the classical period theorized as mimesis. As already mentioned, when composing his new anthropology of art, Alfred Gell was mainly interested in indigenous, non-mimetic art. In a way, he seemed to succumb to the old Eurocentric discrimination between the high classical art of Greece and Rome, which was and still is believed to have fertilized the culture at large, and the arts of peripheral, primitive, or exotic cultures that were only significant insofar they attracted the gaze of a Westerner connoisseur or collector, what Johannes Fabian in 1983 had described as the allochronic bias in anthropology. However, even in an art carrying the burden of classicism, such as the art of ancient Greece, one can locate the animist beliefs inherent in the effigies of gods I describe here, acting as indexes of divine presence, as Gell would term such images. The dedications by Mantiklos and Nicandri are not merely attempts to represent the non-representable, but to objectify divine agency, empowering it for humanity. Animism substantiates the power of the god, his or her ability to offer pleasing rewards, as Mantiklos would hope, and thus the statue is employed in order to channel divine agency towards the dedicant as well as the viewer. By classifying these idols as art according to the Eurocentric paradigm, and quite incompetent art at that, primitive and incomplete, we have neutralized them. The rendering of Nicandri's dedication, what in standard art historical terminology is referred to as Daedalic, from the mythological first Greek sculptor, is highly stylized, heavy with hieratic symbolisms, official attire, and vibrant painted decoration that would surprise most modern viewers. Through the technologies we classify often dismissively as archaic, Daedalic, primitive, and so on, such as the so-called triangular structure of the face, the tripartite wig the statues seem to be carrying, or the angular frontal and schematic fashioning of the body, the sculptors of the archaic period did not so much endeavor to emulate nature and failed, but tried quite successfully, woe to assume, to materialize the immaterial. This technology's work was the production of what in Greek art can be understood as monumentality, an imposing three-dimensional presence affecting the viewer through the force of the materials it is made of. The Apollo dedicated by Mantiklos and Nicandri's Artemis function therefore as totems. They realize the connection between the world of the humans and the world of the spirits. In other words, rather than acting as mere carriers of cultural meaning, they also function as its creators. Entangled in a relational system of which they are at the same time objects and subjects, they are turned into agents of cultural interaction. From within the Western humanist tradition, the idea that inanimate things can affect the life and thoughts of humans seems preposterous, cutting against the grain of Western epistemology as it were. Yet, we all feel comfortable with the notion that humans can nurture feelings about them. From the discussion of various forms of non-human agency, it is clear that although it is humans who imbue things with agency, once a thing has been turned into an agent, there is no turning back. As an object, it is now inseparable from its newly found agency. It is within this relational system described above that things become significant in themselves, and to the extent human actors have agreed to surrender portions of their own agency to them. Art enables flows of social agency in classical Greece through its interaction with current ideas of what constitutes a self, or indeed a person. But the discussion about persons and personhood is another matter altogether. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitris. Now, again, we can give our praise to the speaker and proceed to the questions or remarks or any kind of comments raised by the speech that we've just heard. Monica, yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Dimitris, for this kind presentation in line with the ontological turn. That was very nice. I would like to ask one question in regard with history of archaeology. You termed paradigm shifts as turns. So is there any specific intention why you do that when you're talking about processual and post-processual paradigm shifts? You said that are turns. So turns are very popular these days: ontological turn, animal turn, material turn. So why are you doing that? That's my question.
Oh, because I'm a traditionalist. All those terms go back to the linguistic turn, which is the first half of the 20th century. So after that, I think it's just a question of turns, the pictorial turn, the culturalist turn, and all this. So I just used it like this because I believe that the archaeological shifts, the paradigmatic shifts in archaeology with new archaeology and post-processual archaeology follow those turns with their own qualifications, but they're influenced by those turns in many respects, and as the agents of those shifts have actually confessed or professed. So this is why I'm using and I like the term.
Okay, thank you.
That's the best reason ever to use the term, because one likes it. Thank you, Monica. Is there? Oh,
I want to make a comment on artifacts determining behavior. In what I read from Bruno Latour, there is no instance in which what Latour does is determined by artifacts. He is a master of everything, and he describes his action as assembling. In order to work, his actor networks have to be assembled. As the assembler is described by him as a puppeteer. And what he does resembles very much political action. He creates his constituencies of people and objects. And he thinks also scientists do the same way when they produce their scientific facts. So I don't think there is no reflexivity in what he writes, and he rejects reflexivity. So I think it's useful because it makes good points. He makes good points, but it's not good as an archaeological theory.
Well, it's not an archaeological theory. We're going to do that. But I agree with Alec. Latour, all those major thinkers can be disappointing at times because, first of all, they all think very much of themselves. And this is evident in their work, as it is evident perhaps in our own work. We, in our effort to demolish the idea of the author, the creator, or the producer, the agent, we try to construct us as the author. And Foucault and Roland Barthes certainly did that, and they're guilty of that. Now, concerning the network and the assemblage idea, I like the idea of a network, and I also, even more so, I like the idea of assemblages. Now, what is interesting, and since we're talking about languages now, I read, like most people I know, we read Guattari and Deleuze in English. And of course, the idea of the assemblage is very prominent in the work, and we all talk about assemblages, and we try to translate this in Greek. and we fail and all this. And recently, I happened to I needed to check the original, the French original, and they realized, to my shame, because I didn't know this before that they never use the word assemblage, for example, in the original French. They talk of constellation, which is an extremely interesting concept, and the constellation of things, which is a completely different thing. Being part of a constellation is completely different from being part of an assemblage, and actually creating. You can create an assemblage, you can assemble an assemblage, you cannot constellate a constellation. So that's interesting. So I'm more akin to the idea of assemblages the way described by Deleuze and Guattari and the other post-humanist French people. I don't know why France gave us so many post-humanists, but there you have it.
Well, France gave us quite a lot of things, starting with cheese. No, talking about,
I produce my own cheese. Thank you very much.
Well, that's good for you. Well, Greek cheese is also a thing. Okay, if I can again abuse my position, the whole new turn, the whole new bunch of turns that Dimitris was touching upon, animal turn, like Monica said, or ontological turn, or many other new materialist ways of putting it, are, to my opinion, extremely important challenges to our thinking, archaeologists' thinking. But also, there are quite a lot of things that I'm quite worried about, and some of them were raised similar to what Alex said. This puppeteer idea, this kind of hidden power idea is what worries me quite a lot, for lots of reasons. And I might be coming back to that tomorrow when my own presentation is in place. But let me just raise one issue concerning your own presentation and your interesting attempt to harness it on your own material that you work with, early bronzes, early Greek bronzes, that I am also quite familiar and eager to talk about. You've chosen to present objects like as agents in their own right. Did I understand correctly? And you chose two objects with inscriptions. And these inscriptions underline, as far as I understood, your point that these objects are somehow acting on their own, among other things, because they have inscriptions. But to my thinking, these inscriptions are eminently anthropogenic, aren't they?
That was the question. Yes.
There are people thinking about these words, putting them in writing, which is quite a complex process, and I won't go into it. Thinking about a formula and then putting the formula into a language, into a particular situation, and then inscribing it. And then other people reading it, giving it meaning, because otherwise it would only be scratches on the surface. So there are lots of people involved in this agency of objects, from what I can see. So, and why I'm reacting is because I've had a very similar discussion with a colleague of ours in Belgrade some time ago, because he was doing a very similar thing that you just did with Roman time funerary tombstones with inscriptions. And I also raised the same question, because these inscriptions, to my mind, are eminently proving the agency of humans in the whole story, much more than the agency of objects.
Okay, what you just described, I call the anthropocentric fallacy.
Okay, I'm guilty of that. I totally admit.
Because we are humans and we understand, we perceive the world as our own habitat, we interpret it as a human habitat, and pretty much the creation of ourselves or our imaginaries, which is correct, because this is true. Of course, the object was created by a person, It was inscribed by a person, it was dedicated by a person, the sanctuary was built by a person, by many people, whatever. The money was made or created or imagined by people, and so on and so forth. The point of materialist archaeology, or actually post-humanist archaeology, is not that. Is not to pretend that something that comes to our field of vision is God-given or created on its by itself. Is to enable us as archaeologists, as scholars, to imagine the hitherto hidden dynamics behind these creations, because of course they're human creations. But and as a classical archaeologist, I have suffered long enough by the predominant paradigm of the artist and the masterpiece and the art history that stops at the point of production, that never exits the atelier, that you study the iconography, you study the style, and that's it. When the artifact leaves the atelier, you stop studying, and what happens afterwards does not affect you and does not affect the world you're discussing, you're studying. By reversing the agency flow, we managed to see how things can operate in different sorts of constellations, to reimagine those constellations. A traditional archaeologist would come and tell you, based on the woman on the statue of Artemis dedicated by Nicandri, that Nicandri had the agency to make the offering. She was somebody in her society, whereas in my reading, Nicandri is also an artifact produced by her father, her brother, and her newlywed husband, who are all mentioned in the inscription. In 1975, when Martin Robertson published his history of Greek art, he complains about the statue. He says it looks so bad that at least we could have known the name of the sculptor, but he was stupid enough to fill his space with all those names. He doesn't understand why all these names are there. And he omitted his own. And it would be so nice to have his name, this Naxian sculptor who produced the statue, as the first Greek sculptor. So by reversing this flow of agency, I'm encouraging myself and others to rethink the way art was produced and the ways art was meaningful. So the thing about inscriptions, objects, of course I choose the objects with the inscriptions intact. There were many more which have lost. Every statue in a Greek cemetery or a Greek sanctuary had an inscription. We don't have them all now, but they had them then. It's interesting that they all address the viewer in the first person. It is me, the statue, who speaks.
Yes.
Okay. It's an interesting triangulation of who's watching what. But they are inscribed not because the producer wants to, their maker wants to imbue them with agency. They're inscribed because they have it in the first place. If I take my cup, this plain white cup, and write something on it, it's not because I want to make it imbued with an agency it doesn't have. It's because I already believe it has it. That's why I'm putting it in my constellation of things, not artifacts. I make it an artifact by acknowledging the fact that it is already imbued with agency. It's like talking to your computer, talking to your printer who refuses to print in the morning. Milena knows I was looking for my glasses all morning. It's like, where have they gone? It's an agency they already have, even before you acknowledge it.
No, I completely agree and support the idea that we should try and think about objects in their own right, with their own secret lives, especially when my glasses are lost. But what struck me as strange is that that this is the second instance that I witness classical archaeologists trying to apply the tenets of the ontological turn or new materialism, however we choose to label the thing, using it on the material that bears inscriptions. And there's something interesting for me in that, because inscriptions are eminently abstract things made by humans, for humans, regardless of the fact that I completely relate to that you have to have a certain amount of idea about an object in order, about its inane capacities, in order to inscribe something on it. I'm completely in accordance with that. But nevertheless, the inscription somehow is for me one problem more in the whole series of related happenings.
But the inscription is also part of the artifact, and it
Yes,
actually it enables my point that the maker of the object is not the sculptor, is the person who makes the dedication. In the case of Nicandri, is her father, not even herself. That's why we use them. But of course, we do this with non-inscribed objects as well, but using different techniques. It's like these are better stories, actually. That's why you use them in conference.
So if we were in Sofia, now the two of us would go and have a coffee and continue this discussion. Yes. Unfortunately, we have to have a coffee break separately, each in every house of, or office of ours.
I already had my coffee.
Yeah, well, and according to our program now, we have half an hour break, coffee break. Well, I would call it a Zoom break to kind of relax our eyes a bit and our attention, which is running all over the screen. So Diana, will you now take over, please?
Sasha, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that since now the conversation gathered some momentum, if there are other people who want to jump in now, because very soon we're also having lunch break, so please do not feel inhibited that much to come to this discussion. If there is somebody else who wants to react either to Alex's presentation or to Dimitris's or both, please do feel to do so. We can give another 5-10 minutes, let's say, and then have 20 minutes break, and then we have one presentation and a whole hour lunch break. So do feel free. Of course, if there are no reactions, we can.
I can see two hands raised.
Yeah, okay.
Stasha obviously can't see those yellow hands.
No, I can't. I'm sorry. I don't know why, but I don't see hands.
It's not only me. It's also
it's Yorgos and Alexander.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well,
just with my Zoom.
Just a short comment, and it has been cleared by what Stasha and Dimitris said. It's about inscriptions that prove agency of humans, human agency, but in my opinion, nothing less than human agency in creation of the objects and statues. So it's just the same thing. They're both human agency. Inscriptions are just a little bit more understandable to us. That's the whole difference, the way I see it. Just a short comment, sorry. It has been cleared in what in your subsequent discussion. Thank you.
I think Yorgos Vouranakis has
yes, may I just jump in, because I would also like to make a short comment on agency. Well, let me say first of all that I agree with Dimitris that well, human beings are relationally constructed. That's true. We're all cyborgs, whether we like it or not. This is where, well, material culture and its role comes into play. And that's why I agree and appreciate relational approaches. I think that, however, what worries me is agency. I know we now we're used to accept the agency of non-human entities, but agency started as a term that describes human action, that describes knowledgeable human action and the human ability to be reflective from the knowledge of our context, even if this knowledge is partial, and it usually is partial. And I know that agency has been reconceptualized to include non-human entities, but I think this reconceptualization may not have been a successful step. I can see entanglement, as Jan Hodder calls it, and I agree with entanglement, the entanglement of human and non-human entities. I can see the affect of non-human entities or the affect of constellations. I'm not sure if agency is the most successful way to describe what non-human entities do to us and to the world. I agree that they do something, but it's just that I feel that agency in a way mixes the fact that we may not be the privileged entities in the world, with all entities, both human and non-human, being the same, which is different. I think human beings and their agency should be kept separate, but not necessarily privileged. This is the comment.
If I may answer, yes, I agree with that. I think it's in my mind, it's obvious that we do not think human agency is the same as material agency. That's why perhaps I don't mention this all the time. I think we as humans, we cannot really accept it. But I do believe that material agency is something that we as humans offer to the material world. But once we've done this, there's no turning back. Once I decide that an object is significant to me for some reason, because it's a holy icon, or because it is a memento, or because it scares me, or I love it, or whatever, then there's no way of de-thinking it. And then it becomes independent of my own agency, I think, in my mind, obviously, because it cannot walk or do things to me. Hopefully, I don't know. And I think Alec has raised his hand.
Yes, a very short comment coming back to the gap. There is no Romanian word for agent. And that says how little impact had on the local researchers. People who do that, who are interested in agency, are interested because well, not because, are interested in what Western scholars say about agency. There is no autonomous thinking about this in my country. And about many other matters, like ethnic phenomena. So if I try to learn something about the archaeological understanding of ethnic phenomena, of course, I can read what my colleagues write. It's useless. I mean, it's just, I can use it to prove some points, but not to learn something. So I think this discussion about agency and how agency is used in our environment as a scientific notion, it's telling something about the gap I was speaking.
Well, let me add to your worries. There isn't a word for agency in my language either, and there isn't one in Bulgarian, I gather from Diana's reactions, and for that matter, there isn't one in German. So it is quite a widespread thing that we all battle with the translation, because it's not only a translation, it's also a transponation of the idea. It is a very complex one. And furthermore, even some English-speaking people were objecting to the term quite a long while ago, saying that agency makes them think about travel agency. So it is an unlucky term, I think, in spite of the fact that it has its very useful purposes, but it is obviously a very unlucky term. Okay.
It's not uncommon. The same problem is not uncommon in Greece. I remember the dislike of the term when it first came out. When poor Alfred Gell was writing his book and he was dying in Oxford, I was in Oxford at the time as well, but I never met him and I didn't even know he existed before his book came out. But I remember coming to Greece for the summer or for Easter or whatever, and we were talking about agency. There is a Greek term for it. It's not a single word, unfortunately. Yorgos and myself and Yannis, I think, are using different versions of it in our classes. And our students, every time I mention the term, they say, "Is that the same as this one that Professor Louvrenakis says?" Yeah, that's the same. But there is a Greek term for personhood now, which I have proposed. So I think, yeah, you need to do it. You know, if you need the term, you need to do it. And I had students working on these things in English, writing the thesis in English, so we never needed the term. But then my first student writing a dissertation in Greek needed to use the term, so we had to come up with a viable translation, and there you have it.
Let me expand the thing. When there was the first time I confronted the need to say somehow to put agency in Serbian, I asked our colleague from the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade. She's a sociologist, and she is extremely familiar and has done a lot of work on this particular subject from the point of view of sociology. And at the same time, she is a very accomplished translator of academic literature from and to English. So I asked her, how the hell do you say agency in Serbian? And she said, I don't. So from that very particular authority came the sentence, I don't. So that's not only an archaeological problem.
Well, there's always one who does. So yeah, you have to ask the right people.
No, I think she was cautious, and that's not because she was lazy to think of it, but because she was cautious in translating and introducing a new term into the academic community, not only sociological, but also any other discipline that might reach out for the term. Okay, Diana, do we leave the Zoom open or we log on to the meeting again in 15 minutes?
As you prefer, but you're free to leave it open and come back in 20 minutes.
Okay, in 20 minutes, we get back for the third and last presentation of the morning session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.